Today is the 8th of April, 2009. We are at the Buffalo Erie County Historical Society, and my name is Wayne Clark, and my assistant is Kathleen Matthews. Sir, for the record, would you please state your full name and your date and place of birth?
The legal name Bernard Orzel. I had been known as Bob since I was a little kid.
Okay. And where did you go to school?
I was reared in Buffalo, and I went to schools not very far from here.
Okay.
PS 42, which was on Grant, Burgard High School, and in order to get to school, I walked by this building to get to a place in Delaware Park from which I would hitchhike to Burgard, which was on Kensington Avenue. Burgard was a aviation technical school, a 4-year high school.
Okay. Did you graduate from there?
Yes, I graduated from there.
What year did you graduate?
In 41.
Okay. And did you enter the service at that time, or did you go to work?
No, from high school I went and worked at Bell Aircraft, which is just down Elwood Avenue in Buffalo, and worked there for only 3 months maybe. I was dissatisfied with the kind of job they had given me. I thought I was overqualified for that. Went to Curtis and got a much better job as an aircraft loftsman, and worked there until December. No, actually I left in October, but I was then picked up. I had joined the cadet corps, an aviation cadet, and from there I went into service directly from Buffalo to San Antonio, Texas.
Okay. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
Oh no, I enlisted in the aviation cadet corps.
All right. And when did you go in? What was the approximate date?
December 14th of 42.
42.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I had actually enlisted in April, and was not called up until the time I entered.
All right. And you went for your basic training? Where was that?
I went to San Antonio to the classification center, where we went through physical exams, testing of various kinds, and then if you passed, you went either into pilot, navigator, or bombardier training. I qualified for pilot, but then I washed out of pilot training, and they offered an opportunity of going into something they called aerial observer. I had no idea what that was. But it was going to be much better than having flunked out of pilot training, I thought. And I was ready then to do anything, go overseas immediately. It was because flying had been a desire of mine since I was in the 5th grade.
Did you ever fly at all before you went into the service?
No, only getting airplane rides. So they sent me from there to gunnery school, aerial gunnery school.
And whereabouts was that?
In Fort Myers, Florida, Buckingham Field. Completed the gunnery training.
How long was that training, approximately?
Maybe 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay. And you learned the 50 caliber machine guns? Is that what you were?
Well, went through the whole thing, handguns, fixed machine guns on the ground, 30
Mhm.
caliber, started with that, and then up to 50 caliber firing from an airplane.
Okay.
Completed that and went into radar training, which was at Boca Raton, Florida. And that was a ground school training. I don't recall how many weeks that was. Well, my mother was severely ill after I had been in that course for 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I was given a leave, came back to Buffalo, and after she died, I went back in, and that was within 2 weeks, I believe. And since I had missed out on completing that class, I was just sitting around.
Mm-hmm.
So I found a way to evade getting stuck with kitchen duty or some such thing, because at that time I was a corporal. I had been not downgraded, but reverted to enlisted status.
Uh-huh.
So we used to hitchhike to Fort Lauderdale. There was another fellow and I, and we enjoyed ourselves lolling on the beach at Fort Lauderdale,
Mm-hmm.
existing on very little money, even to finding coconuts on the road and breaking them down and getting something to eat that way. Then when the next course was coming up, I went back into formal training, completed that, and then went over to Orlando, Florida, where we started the aerial training. And the first, got to Orlando in the late afternoon, and had something to eat, settled myself down in quarters, and went down to the flight line immediately. I wanted to get up there and start flying again. And ran into a pilot who was preparing to take off. He was scheduled to fly a kind of training mission or orientation mission in an A-20. And he asked if I wanted to ride, and I jumped at that immediately. This would be the first time I had been in an airplane other than in primary flying school.
Mm-hmm.
And then we eventually teamed up together, Roy Segel and I.
Oh, the pilot you ran into?
Yes, yeah. And we stayed together until we cracked up at the beginning, the night of the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge.
Okay.
It had been a very busy night trying to chase down German planes that were coming in low.
Mm-hmm. All right, before let's go back first to where you were at for your initial training before you went overseas. So you completed that phase. You went on to that particular course. You completed that, and how did you team up with that pilot that
Yeah.
took you up initially?
Oh yeah, after completing that course, upon graduating, I was appointed a flight officer. And it was then that I met Roy Segel.
Okay.
And we teamed up and we did our flight night training.
Okay, now what was the duties of a flight officer?
It was very much like a second lieutenant.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, the majority of the flight officers were I was a radar operator.
Radar, okay. All right.
Sat in the back of the A-20s. Actually, the A-20 was modified and designated as a night fighter, a P-70.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the only U.S. night fighters until the P-61 came along, which was when we went to Europe.
Mm-hmm. Now that radar school that you attended, of course, radar was kind of in its infancy at that point, wasn't it?
Very much so. It was very hush-hush.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea what this aerial observer thing was like. It wasn't until after we got to the basic radar ground school that we began getting some kind of inkling as to what we're going to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Was it a difficult school?
Not particularly,
Mm-hmm.
but I was academically oriented to begin with, so
Uh-huh.
I was able to handle that kind of thing fairly easily.
Okay. And once you completed that course, you became a flight officer, and then you teamed up with an air crew?
Well, that was the air crew. It was just two of us,
Okay.
the pilot and myself, in this kind of plane.
Okay.
And we went through practice training, and this would be, two planes would take off at the same time. The task was that one would take off and become the target plane. The following plane would try to follow it, and this was in daytime first.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a certain amount of time, they would change roles. The target would then take on the chase role.
Mm-hmm.
And the radar operator and the pilot would become accustomed to working together, with the radar operator calling out where the target was on the screen that he was able to see
Okay.
in front of him, give him directions to increase speed, decrease it, turn port or starboard, and then retard speed as you began approaching.
Now, as radar operator, were you also responsible for making radio calls and navigation?
Well, yes, it did some navigation, but the radio calls were the duty of the pilot.
Okay.
The radio was in the pilot's cockpit, and the radar operator had no access to any of that, not even the instrumentation. We did not have altimeters, airspeed indicators, or anything back there.
Okay. All right. And how long did that go on for?
A number of months, I don't recall exactly.
Okay.
There were a fixed number of hours that you had to put in each of the phases.
And then eventually you were shipped overseas next, or?
All the radar training had been in Central Florida,
Mm-hmm.
around Orlando, and then there were a number of satellite fields from which the crews were sent for further training,
Mm-hmm.
because this took up airspace, and they were getting ready then to introduce the new crews into the eventual combat that would be taking place. Let's see. For some reason, the higher echelons decided they're going to transfer the radar training to the West Coast, centered around Fresno, California. So at that point, we were just terminating our final phase. We hadn't completed it yet. And this was in Kissimmee, Florida. And this was in the P-70s. And at that phase, there was a squadron that was being formed, and they were based at Kissimmee. And amongst the radar operators of that squadron were some of the guys with whom I had started my last phase of training.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it so happened that later, we ended up in that same squadron. So it was an interesting kind of comforting thing for me
Mm-hmm.
to be in with some people that I had known in the past. Well, when we finished our training in Fresno, within a matter of a week or less, we were ordered to ship out. We were flown from Fresno to Hammond Field in San Francisco, and then by train we crossed the continent and went to a port outside of New York.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall the port base at the time. And went overseas by boat and ended up in England.
Did you go over in a convoy or a single ship?
Oh yes, in a convoy, yeah.
Okay.
Very large convoy. The ship stretched out for miles in both directions.
Did you get seasick at all?
No, I did not, fortunately, and I came back by boat.
Mm-hmm.
And I had gone back over after I had married to visit my wife's parents in Scotland. And I was not seasick.
Mm-hmm.
I was very fortunate in that regard.
Now, do you recall the date when you left or arrived in Europe?
Arrived in England, it must have been latter part of March or early April
Of
of 44.
44? Okay.
Yeah. And then went to this new squadron, the 422nd. At that point, they had ended up in a field in northern England, Squadron, England.
Mm-hmm.
And they did not yet have their P-61s. They were flying 2 or 3 airplanes, an English Anson twin-engine trainer, a BT-10, and that was out of service because the young crew on it had gone out flying around and flying over the home of a young woman that the pilot had met somewhere and crashed and killed
Oh,
themselves.
gee.
When we got our P-61s, we had no time in the P-61. Some of the 422nd people in Florida had a chance to get checked out in P-61s, but they were very few in number there, so we had to kind of orient ourselves to a new aircraft, and it was also a new radar set, which was an improvement over what we had been using before.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in comparison to what we know now as radar, it was extremely primitive. But to us, it was a great advancement. And we flew daylight missions and then night training missions. But the Brits, who in a sense trained us, were fully equipped with all kind of night fighting equipment and squadrons. They didn't have any need for Americans to come in.
Mm-hmm.
So they weren't too anxious to have us around. It wasn't until after D-Day, where the U.S. forces established themselves on the French coast,
Mm-hmm.
that we began taking on a really active role, flying over our own sector.
Now, did you participate in the D-Day invasion at all, flying? Or?
No,
Okay.
no, we didn't get over for about a month after D-Day.
Okay.
The Brits handled that very well. They didn't need us at that point.
Okay.
And by the way, they helped to train us. We used a British Wellington bomber
Mm-hmm.
as a trainer. The Brits used that kind of bomber to train their own night fighter crews. And they were a good bunch. And we were on a small British airfield. We were treated very well by them.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back on it, they were very tolerant of these young, aggressive Yanks who really were wet behind the ear.
Mm-hmm.
And talking to some of these guys who had been in combat and in service for 3-4 years already. And they probably were saying to themselves, you'll find out. And we did.
Now, what was your first combat mission like?
Very routine,
Mm-hmm.
very much like the training missions. Took off, went to an assigned patrol area, and we were directed by ground radar. We're always under the control of ground radar.
Mm-hmm.
And we just controlled back and forth. At that point, it was flying east and west, in a sense to keep the German bombers off of the American troops.
Mm-hmm.
And it was totally dark. There were no lights. We showed no lights. We could tell where the front lines were because of the artillery fire outgoing, and then the incoming artillery fire when the shells exploded on the ground. We had some idea
Mm-hmm.
of the front line. And it was summertime, and the nights were quite short. So we didn't get that much time, and ordinarily we would be on 2 nights and off 2 nights.
Mm-hmm.
And there would be two crews going up and assigned to their patrol area. And then after 2.5 hours or so, return to base with another 2 crews coming in to take over their role. And this went on. Usually you put in 2 missions a night. During the winter, later on, sometimes we would get in 3 missions a night. And it was rather boring sitting there. It was a pilot who was occupied. He had a full instrument panel. He had to be paying attention to all of his instruments, his altitude,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth, even though he was being controlled from the ground. And for the radar operator, it was a matter of just looking at the scope, usually seeing very little, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
It was only when you got a target that the radar operator became involved. And the ground controller would direct the pilot as close as he could to the target, and a target could be a friendly or an enemy. And in the radar at that time, if the two blips on the screen came closer than a mile or so away,
Mm-hmm.
they'd merge into each other, and the ground controller couldn't tell which was which.
Uh-huh.
So the radar operator in the plane had to get this blip on his scope and begin guiding the pilot into the target. And depending upon what the plane was doing, whether he was flying evasively
Mm-hmm.
or whether he was flying straight and level, it would keep you on your toes to try to follow him.
Mm-hmm.
And then get in close enough so the pilot could make a visual. Now this is at night,
Yeah.
total darkness, and under some conditions you might see an enemy plane that, under very conditions, almost a half mile away. the pilot could.
Mhm.
Other times, you could bring the pilot into within 500-600 feet before he could spot it, depending upon what the background was and the kind of plane. Generally, they were multi-engine planes. The Germans had primarily two-engine aircraft, they're bombers. It was rare that you would latch on to a single-engine fighter or anything else.
Now, if you latched onto a German aircraft and identified it as German, did you have the capability of shooting it down?
The radar operator didn't. It was all in the hands of the pilot.
Right, but there were guns on board?
Oh, yes, oh, yeah,
Okay.
yes, yeah. And that was a significant thing. You had to identify the plane. And this is both the pilot and the radar operator had to identify it, because you might be shooting at a friendly.
Sure.
So if he got in behind, and generally I would direct him so that he was beneath as well as behind. And I could look up from my position in the back and see the plane. And if it was four-engine, it was not a German, almost absolutely, because they had few four-engine planes operating at night over the front lines. It would be a British bomber, a Lancaster, a Halifax, Sterling, or a Liberator, or B-17, because the U.S. did operate some four-engine bombers on kind of reconnaissance, leaf-dropping missions, surveillance, sometimes dropping supplies behind the enemy lines to Allied French or even Polish troops in Poland. So you had to make that kind of identification.
Did you encounter very many German aircraft?
Not as much as the day fighters, nowhere near as much. It was rare, and everyone wanted a shot at these. I mean, all of the crews did. So we were very eager to get our chance at it. And there was a big celebration when the first German plane was shot down. Oh, another thing that was interesting, in the 9th Air Force, we left from England, went over to France, and after that we lived in tents on under rather primitive kinds of conditions. The airfields we operated out of were former bombed out German fields, which were repaired and rehabbed as best as they could, and then you moved U.S. Air Corps forces in there. And we always had day fighters. This would be P-38s, P-47s, P-51s operating from these fields. We're a single squadron, and there might be two, and at one time there were even 3 groups of day fighters. And you might have, and all day long these fellas were taking off. Their missions were short also, sometimes only an hour away, because we were followed along, moved from airfield to airfield. And the day fighters went up in direct support of the troops that were advancing or were stuck and trying to advance, and the ground troops needed support, bombing, machine gunning, rocketing. So you'd seen them going off as many as 36 at one time. And then after getting rid of all the ammo, returning and coming back. And it was a big show every single day. On the one field where we stayed the longest, which was in Belgium, we were on a bit of a knoll. And it was just fantastic to see these planes taking off, two at a time, one right behind the other, in a field that had been a German night fighter field, and badly devastated, muddy as heck during the rain, but the runways were fairly solid, so you could take off.
Now, did you normally fly on the same plane, or?
No. We just, there were some pilots that were assigned, or crews that were assigned to a plane, but if there was no other plane available, you just took it, and that was it. You were assigned to it by the operations officer, who had the usual big blackboard, and he had the crew, the plane numbers, and the crew assigned to fly that night, and it would be 2 missions a night, and when you came down, the ground crew would check it over, refuel it. If any ammunition had been expended, they would replenish that. Then we'd go to the mess tent and have something to eat, usually oatmeal and coffee for a night thing. And we slept in tents, we ate in tents, and it was somewhat primitive life as compared to the 8th Air Force. And I'm fortunate enough to be a member. They've accepted me in this 8th Air Force Historical Society. And I kid with them about this, and they kid back about, you were up only 2 hours, and you came back down? And we were up there for 12 hours.
Now, what was the general altitude you flew at, or did it vary?
Yeah, this is another thing different from the 8th. They went up to 25, 20, 30,000 feet sometimes. We operated at around 10. And the reason for that was, this is about the altitude that the German planes came in on. So there was no reason to go up any higher. You didn't have to dive down on them.
Yeah.
There was usually enough time to catch up to them. The problem at night would be trying to avoid the British bombers when they were going out or coming back in, because they never flew in a tight formation. They were spread out. They flew by time intervals and varying altitudes. So you might be flying through a stream of these British bombers. Our ground controllers tried to avoid putting us in situations like that, but they had no idea when the British raid was going on or when they were coming back from a raid. And that could be pretty hairy if we got tangled up in a stream of the British bombers coming in or out.
Okay.
In fact, more than once, we would be patrolling when the lines were fairly static prior to the Battle of the Bulge. And the airfields like Cologne, the city of Cologne, we would be flying near there. We would be flying beyond the front lines, east of them, into the German territory to try to catch the planes before they got to our lines. And we saw raids on these cities, like Cologne was the most significant one I saw. And you'd see all the flak going up, and this is the only thing you could see, you know, the bursts of flak up there. And occasionally they'd happen to catch a British bomber
Mhm.
and the thing exploding and coming down. And we could appreciate how fortunate we were
Mhm.
in being a totally different situation.
Now, you did mention a situation earlier with the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes, yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Well, it was on the, I think it was the 16th or 17th night of 1780, right in through there, but it was the beginning. It was not known to us that the Germans were trying to make a breakthrough. And there had been quite a bit of activity, and it was at fairly low altitude. And if I may interject something, radar had its limitations then. The range on our scope was related to the elevation above ground. If we were a mile above ground, supposedly we should be able to detect a German plane a mile away.
Mhm.
Anything less than that, you would get a return, which we called ground clutter. It was a return from the ground. So targets were very difficult to discern
Mhm.
if you got anywhere near this ground level. And the Germans then were coming in and dropping flares, and we assumed that they were probably single-engine fighter planes doing this. And following them would be the twin-engine bombers. And both of them would be coming in very fast. So we had trouble trying to catch up to these guys. And we began running out of fuel. We got on a tail of two of them, got within close enough distance to one, and then he dropped his flares, and this was startling as all hell to the pilot, who all of a sudden sees this bright thing in front of him, and we're at low altitude.
Mhm.
So he pulled up to avoid whatever might be there, you know, an exploding airplane or what. Well, we started running out of fuel. In the meantime, the fog had begun drifting in and covering almost all of Belgium, Holland, and northern France. And we were in Belgium at the time. And it was time for us to return. We had been up over 3 hours, and the fuel consumption at those speeds had been pretty high. And we couldn't get back to our own field, it was socked in. And they directed us to several others, and they were socked in. Well, the other thing is, in that general area, Belgium and northern France, we were the only airfield that had any kind of night landing facility
Mhm.
or abilities. And then, as I recall, it was only one string of lights on one side of the runway, not even a double set. And no approach lights, or just these lights. And of course, the pilots were skilled. They were very good instrument pilots.
Mhm.
So there were no lights at all to the one field they set us to, A84. Where the hell was it? Chevrolet, the French name, which I have difficulty pronouncing even. And we made a number of passes, the fuel supply getting even lower. And we couldn't get down. Oh, what they did, the day fighters, they sent a guy out to the end of the runway and had him firing a Very pistol, a flare. And knowing that and the direction of the runway, our hope was that we'd be able to come in over the flare and then let down and then maybe see enough to get down on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And hadn't done this. All I could see, sitting in the back of the plane, the glow of the flare. You send a flare up and it becomes nothing but, not even one intense light, but a glow, which lasted for a minute or however long the flare stayed up in the air. And we were having no luck. Oh, by the way, another one of our crew members had been trying to get into the same field. And the pilot said, it's not possible. I'm not going to be able to get in there. I'm going to try something else. Now, what he intended to try, I don't know. But later we learned that he cracked up, whether he ran out of fuel. I don't know where he could have been trying to land under those conditions, but they just didn't make it. So it came to the point where Roy said, look, this is the last one. We either go up to bail out or we try to come down. I said, take it down. At that point, we were down to only a few planes in the squadron. We had called up reserves from southern France and Italy, and they send up some of their P-61s. They were also using British night fighters, a Beaufighter, and we had several of those on our field. Well, we tried to get down, and there was a crashing, rendering of sounds, metal being torn apart, and finally the thing stopped rolling. And the plane is up on one main gear, the nose wheel is wiped out, the port main wheel is wiped out, and it's on its nose tilted. And I was able to get out the top hatch and slide down the wing to the cockpit, and Roy is trapped in there and can't get out. He's conscious, and I couldn't wedge him out. I had a pistol. We only started wearing pistols after the Battle of the Bulge. We never had firearms up there anyway. Nobody can do with a pistol in Germany. You're not going to battle it out with them. So I fired one shot. The next shell lodged, so it was useless. And shouting out, and we're out in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, they located us, and the plane, it turned out that we weren't on the field itself. We were off the field somewhere. And they came in a Jeep and a truck, and then they got a kind of a wrecker truck, and they began working on trying to free him. Eventually, after maybe an hour, they were able to free him and get him out and get him in an ambulance. And we went to a hospital. I believe it was in Brussels, was a hospital. And then that was the last I saw Roy until after the war. He was hospitalized and then sent home.
Now, were you injured at all?
No, nothing.
No.
Nothing, not even a scratch. And that's what amazed me.
So what happened at that point? Did you fly with somebody else?
That was a frustrating thing for me, because all of these guys were hungry as heck to get in missions, to get chances at getting a victory. And none of them, of course, would willingly give up their mission that night to have you come in and step over.
Mm-hmm.
So in the meantime, the squadron had been assigned a bunch of 820 Havoc twin-engine light bombers. And these were essentially the same planes as we had trained in, converted to night fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So we had an excess of crew to the number of aircraft. So they began assigning us to doing night bombing missions, which were ground controlled. Ground radar would send us out. They'd have some target which had been reported by day fighters. They thought they saw troop vehicles or troop concentrations in some area, and they would identify the coordinates, and then at night they would send us over and have us drop a bomb as they calculated the bomb would be, and we usually flew at 10,000 feet there.
Mm-hmm.
So the pilot would open the bomb bay doors and drop 4 500-pound bombs. Now, the radar operator was up in the turret of this thing. So I started getting permission to fly as a so-called tunnel gunner.
Mm-hmm.
They had a gun facing back from the floor of the bomb. And I got flights in that way. I think on maybe 3 occasions or so did I get a chance as a radar operator. So it was frustrating,
Mm-hmm.
but I had been paid to get in there and do something,
Mm-hmm.
and not given the opportunity of doing it.
Okay. And basically you continued on in that capacity till the war ended?
Yes, yeah. And we kept moving eastward as the troops advanced across France, Belgium, and into Germany and through Germany. Mm-hmm. And there was one time where we only spent a couple days on one field in Germany before being advanced to another field. That was to stay close to the battle lines, to be on, of immediate use
Mm-hmm.
to the ground troops. And this was common for most of the 9th Air Force, the fighters. This is what they did throughout the whole time they were there. And as I kid with the guys, there was no getting home, getting in your pinks and greens and going to London.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were in Germany when the war ended?
Yes, actually, far enough into East Germany, into an area which the Russians later moved into.
Mm-hmm.
We were that far east. I got as far as Leipzig,
Mm-hmm.
which became Russian territory then.
Okay. Once the war ended, were you part of the occupational forces?
Oh, no. Before the war, no. As soon as the war ended, we were slated to go back, the squadron was
Mm-hmm.
slated to go back to the States, re-equip, and
Go to the Pacific?
Pacific. So we were already on our way back from Germany. We got to France and waiting for a boat when the war in the Pacific ended.
Was there a lot of celebration at that point?
Not as wild as you see on these were young men and on their own bases, no
Mm-hmm.
civilian population around. So there was some drinking.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike TV and movies.
So, you got the news that the war ended, and so you were in France for a while until you were able to get a boat back to the States?
For a matter of maybe a month or so.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Even if that long. We came back from Germany and this is the World War I, what do they call them?
Liberty ship?
No. 40 arms and 8 chevaux.
Oh, a 40 and 8?
Yes, yeah.
Either 40 men or 8 horses?
40 men and 8 horses.
Uh-huh.
In those kinds of vehicles.
Okay. And then, did you leave from a place like Camp Lucky Strike, or?
Yeah, I don't even remember the name, but it was one of the cigarette names.
Okay.
And it was out of Le Havre.
Uh-huh.
And initially, when we went over from England, it was not too far from Cherbourg, our first field. It was within less than a mile of the landing grounds, the airfield. And just coming down here today, I noticed what do they call them now? Berms. Outside, someone has built a house and he's got land behind and he's built up a berm.
Mm-hmm.
And as I looked at it, I said, my God, this is just like it was in Normandy. Because he had dumped refuse, branches, trees, and he's building this up. Only then, it took centuries for
Mm-hmm.
them to build these things around their little fields in Normandy. And that's why the frontline troops had such great difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
There was no way of penetrating through these things. They were so solid and had been built up. You know, the stones in the field that the farmers had
Mm-hmm.
from back, 1200 and so forth on. But I'm never complaining about any of the experiences I had. Oh, another thing that is very important to our squadron, we were just one squadron operating independently. Fortunately, our commanding officer had established a good relationship with the guy who was in charge of the 9th Tactical Air Force, Cassata, Elwood R. Cassata. And in a sense, he favored us, or we thought.
Mm-hmm.
He made life a little easier. We could get some supplies in, which we on our own would never have been able to get without a little bit of help from him. But the squadron stayed active. I am still in regular contact with my pilot. We became reattached, and we've had, the night fighters have had many conventions and reunions over the years. We've had a solid organization where we were able to, communicate, pass information back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Laterally, with the reunions, the wives coming in after the younger, wild kind of days, a bunch of guys overindulging, and it's calmed down with age.
Uh-huh.
And we're still in touch with each other. And thinking, I was just talking to the guy who is now the president of our very limited organization, wondering whether we should turn this organization over to the CO's daughter, who is very much involved in this, Judy Johnson. Also, another thing, which is kind of irrelevant, but there was a squadron that was established after the war, the 422nd Test and Evaluation Squadron, based at Nellis in outside Las Vegas. had our number, even our squadron insignia, and they have been involved over the years in testing aircraft, fighter aircraft, relative to how best to use them tactically. Not the aircraft itself, but the employment of the aircraft. And they had invited us over to their place maybe 2-3 times. And we're still in touch with some of them. And to see these guys and the way they looked upon us as though we were something really special. And here they are flying in these super fighter jets, F-22s and F-15s and F-16s, 18s.
Well, you guys paved the way for that.
Well, that's what they say, and yeah, that is true with the radar. Maybe that's why they were assigned that squadron name, because there were only 2 night fighter squadrons in Europe, excluding the Mediterranean area, with a plane that was designed in the U.S. solely for that night fighting purposes. It's a P-61. And a fantastic airplane. They are rebuilding one or restoring one that had cracked up on a mountain in New Guinea, in Reading, Pennsylvania, at a museum there. And it's almost fully assembled, repaired and assembled. And they're hoping to get it flying. Now, whether we're going to be lucky enough to see it, we don't know. You know,
Let me just stop.
the visual.
Okay, you were discharged. When were you discharged?
February, I think, of
46?
47.
Oh, 47.
Because I had to go through a rehab program. Physically, they tried to find out the reason or the cause of my visual condition. And that was another part of my experience. You've seen and heard about the hospital in Washington. The name slips my mind now.
Walter Reed.
Yes, Walter Reed. Well, it was a situation similar to that. I ended up in a hospital with guys of that sort, and they came from various branches of the Army. There were Air Corps, infantry, artillery. Some of them totally blind, amputees, one hand, a hand and an arm, legs. And there was something there that was absolutely fantastic. These were young men. And they were surviving, I think, largely because they were together, going through the same damn thing and having this kind of support. If they had gone home, that never would have happened. Never. Just like these guys out of the military right now. One of the best things for them, I think, is being in a place like Walter Reed for a time, and even cut off from their families and the rest of society, which would help to cripple them permanently.
Now, you mentioned the problem you had with your sight. Did it eventually get sorted out, or restored, or are you still having problems
No.
with it?
No, I'm still having problems. I've never driven. I have problem, with seeing. I have to use these glasses. But I eventually got a degree in social work, and I think that was directly related to that experience.
Okay, I'm going to stop the film right now and put in another cassette because we're about at the end of this one. Now you mentioned having the problems with your sight. When was this first noticed or diagnosed on some of your later missions?
No, it was after the war ended.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I think, at one of the camps. We were out playing baseball, and I was out in the field, and a plane was going by, and I remember very clearly, because when I glanced up, it was a B-25. Now, we did not use, the U.S. did not use B-25s in the ETO, in the European theater. The Brits had some, but why it was there, I don't know. Later I learned that the French squadrons had been equipped with 25s flying out of the Mediterranean area, up Italy and so forth. And then as I tried to refocus, the damn thing disappeared. So I wondered about that, and then I noticed that I was having difficulty. So when it came time to be discharged in the U.S. at Camp Kilmer, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Camp Kilmer. Went through some testing there. I could have gone home, but I thought I'd better get this checked. And they found that I had optic neuritis, which was a degeneration of the optic nerve.
And that was in just one eye, or both?
Both, bipolar, yeah. And it went on from there. Well, it was arrested, and no improvement. And then I went through the rehab. I even learned Braille, thinking, what the heck am I going to do now?
Yeah.
The job I had as a loftsman, this required acute vision, and it was similar to drafting, except you worked on metal and you made forms and you had to transfer an image on paper to a piece of metal after the way it would be bent up into some kind of part of an airplane. And my desire from a kid was to fly. The Air Corps, when they opened up and they said you could get in with without college training, that was fantastic for me. And I wanted to go into engineering. And that was not a possibility. So the social work seemed to be the best kind of thing you do with these limitations.
And you weren't able to drive at all?
Oh, no, no.
Okay. And so obviously when you got out, you did make use of the GI Bill.
Oh, yes, yeah. Although I had been saving money, not that I could have gotten an engineering degree with it, but I would have had a damn good start. Because I was not a big spender.
Okay. And what rank were you when you were discharged? Were you a lieutenant?
Actually, the top active grade I had was first lieutenant. From a flight officer, went overseas as a flight officer, and this was interesting. although this is in a sense a rank below a second lieutenant. You know, my pilot Roy was second lieutenant at the time. I was a flight officer. Well, when I got overseas, I was actually making more than he was because of this unusual thing about a flight officer. It's similar to a warrant officer.
Mm-hmm.
Overseas pay is like that of an enlisted man, 20%. It was then.
Mm-hmm.
An officer is 10%. So with flight pay and that 20%, I was making more than Roy and more than the other pilots in the squadron who were second lieutenants. And this was the same for most of the radar, well, all of the radar operators were flight
Mm-hmm.
officers.
But eventually you were commissioned?
Yes, yeah.
Did you have any choice in the matter, or?
Oh, no, we accepted it. No,
Okay.
with
I mean,
rank,
could you have
with
stayed
rank comes privilege, you know.
Right. But I mean, could you have stayed a flight officer, or they just decided they would do away with that and make everyone a second lieutenant?
No, they kept that up. I have a younger brother who ended up as a P-51 Mustang pilot.
Mm-hmm.
He was 2 years behind me in high school, the same high school. And he enlisted, and he was able to get in with 3.5 years. That they accelerated his high school so he could graduate in 3.5 years instead of 4. So he went directly in and was a flight officer when he flew in the Pacific in fighter planes.
Okay.
But they were still doing that, the flight officer thing back then.
Okay. Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yeah, I joined the VFW. It didn't interest me.
Mm-hmm. Did you stay in contact with any of the people you served with?
Oh yes, that was great. After a number of years, we became very close.
Mm-hmm. And so you've attended a number of reunions too?
Yes, oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And telephoned them. I'm not good at the keyboard. I have a computer.
Mm-hmm.
I can do research on it. But as far as communicating, there are so many typos, and with the glasses I can get right up to the screen and make some corrections, but it becomes too much of a chore
Mm-hmm.
to do that. So I don't use the, I won't even have a, what do they call that, a website? No.
Website or
No.
email address?
Yeah, email, I won't, get these crazy messages, and I don't want to have anything to do with that.
How do you think your time in the service changed or affected your life?
Oh, it affected me totally. I would have gone on a different path,
Mhm.
That's one of the things. But from a emotional, maturation kind of point of view, it was fantastic, absolutely. It was such a positive kind of thing. There were negatives, but
Mm-hmm.
where else can you get experience like this?
Mm-hmm. Do you think you would have gone on to college had it not been for the GI Bill?
Well, I was planning on that. That's why I said I was setting money aside.
Okay.
It would have been UB because they were much closer to an engineering degree than Buff State here. You know, Buff State is right in the neighborhood I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
I could look across Skajacata Creek when I fished, and I could, in fact, the chimes would tell us the time. You know,
Okay.
the hour, the quarter after the half, and 3/4. So I grew up in that neighborhood.
When you were overseas, did you get a chance to see any USO shows like Bob Hope or anything like that?
No.
No?
That's,
Because you guys were always you guys were always on the move.
Yeah, where were they? In a place like Britain or London, yeah,
Mhm.
I could see that, but I couldn't understand it. I did get a chance to go on a kind of a leave to Britain,
Mhm.
and did get to London for a couple of days. I got to Paris for a day or two. That was a negative experience.
Mhm.
London was interesting, but the people I met in Britain, absolutely tremendous, I thought, to us guys. I got to know a few families there,
Mhm.
and they were very welcoming. I have nothing negative to say about them.
Okay.
The French, I didn't get to know because moving so rapidly, and in Belgium there was, because we stayed there longer, there was a bit of acquaintanceship one developed with the Belgians, but it wasn't much.
Mhm. All right, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.